You are officially invited. Yes, you. You're invited to join us in Fertility Awareness Mastery. This is my 10-week program designed to help you gain confidence using fertility awareness. Whether you're actively avoiding pregnancy or looking to optimize your cycles for conception, we have a spot for you. We start on April 23rd. Are you ready to jump in? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program to reserve your spot today. That's fertilityfriday.com/group program. This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. The Fifth Vital Sign is available for purchase on Amazon in ebook and paperback formats. Audio is coming. And you can grab the first chapter for free over at fertilityfriday.com/vital sign. That's fertilityfriday.com/vital sign. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 247. Welcome to the 247th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. Today I have a special episode to share with you, and I'm really excited about it. I've had a lot of requests to talk more about different types of birth control on the podcast, and I try to do it every now and then. And so I've spoken about the copper IUD on a couple of past episodes, and I'll link those episodes to today's episode. But what's great about today is that we have another installment of the Pill Reality series. I mean, I'm just calling it the Pill Reality series and putting all birth control under the umbrella of that. So this is part of the series. But in today's episode, I'm actually interviewing two women who share their experience using the copper IUD. And so we'll start with Nina's story. And so what's really interesting about Nina's story is just, it's a side effect that you wouldn't really expect that she experienced. And so in her case, she really wanted to love the IUD and actually tried to make it work for quite some time. But she found that she experienced some cramping. And you would think that the cramping, if you were to experience cramping using the copper IUD, you would think that the cramping would be during your period. You would think that's, or if you had cramps, it might worsen it a little bit. Some of the common side effects that women speak about are increased menstrual bleeding. So some women, when they use the copper IUD, when they have their period, they experience heavier bleeding. And some women experience stronger cramping. So I know for me, when I was looking into different birth control methods, that was something that really freaked me out about having anything inserted into my uterus. Any possibility that I could have had heavier or more painful periods than I already did, I was completely not interested in signing up for that. But of course, some of the major benefits of using the copper IUD are that it's not hormonal. And so this is, a highly effective method of birth control that does not completely alter your hormonal health. I do talk about it within the two interviews that there is research on the copper IUD and the impact that it has on hormones. And so it's interesting because the copper IUD works in a number of different ways. And one of those ways is by creating localized inflammation inside of the uterus. And another way is through the copper itself. And so copper is, thought to have a bit of a spermicidal effect. So sperm don't really do well in that environment. But what's interesting is that when you look at the research on what happens to the menstrual cycle when a woman is using the copper IUD, she's still ovulating, so she's still having a cycle. And so any woman on the IUD will know that, you do keep ovulating and having a menstrual cycle when you are using the copper IUD. But when you actually look at the progesterone levels and luteal phase length and things like that, it can alter that a little bit. So although you're still cycling, the cycle is altered a little bit, which, in the grand scheme of things is a lot better than having no cycle and no ovulation and none of your natural progesterone. I just think it's always helpful to just have a good sense and understanding of what's happening. So we'll start with Nina's story first, and then we'll jump into Kathryn's experience after that. Now, as you heard in the introduction to the episode, the next round of Fertility Awareness Mastery is starting next month. I'm really excited to be jumping into Fertility Awareness Mastery in April. And if you're new to the show, Fertility Awareness Mastery is my 10-week group program where I join together anywhere from, 6 to 8 women from all over the world. And we meet every single week for 10 weeks. This is an education program, a training program that teaches you how to chart your cycles, how to gain that confidence in using the fertility awareness method to achieve your intentions. And so every time I run the group, I have a mixture of women. And I used to try to separate the groups into specifically women who are trying to conceive and women who are avoiding conception. But what I found was that I always had women who were doing both things in the group. And the reason for that is because, for example, if I'm holding a group for women who are trying to conceive, there's going to be women in the group who are actively trying to conceive. And there's also going to be women in the group who are currently avoiding, but are really planning ahead for pregnancy and wanting to kind of prepare. And so they jump into the conception group. And similarly, in the avoiding pregnancy group, I have women in there who are avoiding, but also planning for pregnancy in the future, whether that's a couple of months from now or whether that's a year or several years down the line. And then I've also had it where in the midst of the birth control group, a woman switches over. And so, she was avoiding pregnancy, but now she's ready. And she just really wanted to get the birth control aspect, confidence in that before she started trying to conceive. So what I've realized over the time that I've been doing this program is that it just makes a lot of sense to bring everyone together because we always cover all of the information. We really cover the strategies to gain that confidence in using fertility awareness for birth control to avoid pregnancy so that you can actually feel really comfortable and confident with the method. I know a lot of women, of course, when you're coming off of birth control, regardless of what type, there's often this huge sense of terror that, is this method going to work for me? Can I really trust it? And you can. The method can work and you can trust it, provided that you receive proper instruction and support in that learning phase. And so I want to personally invite you to join us in our April group. You'll find more information over at fertilityfriday.com/group program. And I hope to see you there. So without further ado, let's jump into Nina's story. And I'm really excited to be here with Nina today. Nina is part of the Fertility Friday community, and recently I put a post in there about different contraceptives. And I do that fairly regularly anyways. But Nina shared a little bit about her story using the copper IUD. So I'm really excited to have her on the show just to kind of raise awareness about, real women's experiences, because that's one of the things that I'm super passionate about. So welcome to the show, Nina.
Hi, good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you for coming on the show. And so, I suppose we can just kind of jump in. Maybe share with us just a little bit about your history using contraceptives, maybe when you got your first period and all of that, and kind of what led you to using the copper IUD and kind of how that all went.
Absolutely. So I got my first period around like 7th grade. So maybe like 12, 13. I don't remember like the exact date. And, when I got my period, obviously like as a 12, 13-year-old, I never tracked it. I had no idea what was going on. Just once a month I would get my period. And, I feel like fortunate to just be one of those people that like, I didn't really have acne. My periods were, I would get cramps, but like, there's nothing like that was so irregular about my periods that I felt the need to ever like address it in a medical setting or to my parents or to like, it was just part of, once a month, like you get your period and then it's done and then you move on. So I really never, because I know some people get put on birth control very early. I never needed to be, to even discuss birth control until, later on when I, became sexually active. So it was really when I was like in my late teens that I started, looking into different avenues. And I started off as anyone else on hormonal birth control. I was on the pill. And I specifically, the way I was raised, like my parents aren't, like vegan hippies by any means, but they're all, they're the kind of people that always like mixed, like Western medicine's fine, but if we can like prevent things, if we can try to go like the more natural route, like that's always like preferable. So, I always knew like medications should never be like the first option. So even with medications, what is the least invasive one you can take to address your issue to start with? So, when I went to my doctor, I asked for, do you have birth control that's low hormone? So yes, at the time, I also didn't know that it does not matter. Hormones are hormones, low hormone or regular amount of hormones. But, I went on the low hormone, orthotricycline low, and I was on it like on and off for a few years. Like basically, when I was like in a relationship, I would be on it and then I'd be off. So I don't have like a a consistent history with hormonal birth control. And it was never really more than a few years, like, of total, birth control use. So, I wasn't in a relationship, so I stopped taking birth control because I didn't need it. At that point, I was like trying to look at, more healthy ways to live. I was like taking other medications for other issues, and I didn't want to, I know like hormones have an effect. Like, nobody told me, like, I didn't listen to any podcasts, but like, as a woman, I have hormones. I know when like certain times of the month I am more hormonal. Like, just hearing those words and understanding like hormones do affect your mood and hormones affect how you function. I always like try to steer clear of anything artificial in that sense. Mm-hmm. So I got in a relationship. I was 21 at the time, and I was looking into birth control options. So I wanted a no hormone birth control option. There weren't so many options. There's still not so many options out there now, aside from, fertility awareness. So I spoke with my doctor, and, I was in a relationship, but also like no intention of like having children in the foreseeable future. So, I did research on the IUD, and wow, what an amazing thing. Like, you set it and forget it, you have up to 15 years to like change your mind, and then you take it out and you go back to business as usual. It seemed like the most appropriate choice for me. When I was 21, I got the IUD. That's how it started. And it lasted less than a year with it, because I was like, I had more of a reaction to the IUD, the copper IUD, than I did like any pill that I've been on.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, and I think it's always helpful in these discussions. I always try to ground them a little bit. I mean, not every woman is going to have the same experience. So lots of women use the IUD for years and basically have very little effects, or maybe nothing that would prevent them from enjoying kind of the benefits of it. So interesting though, because you're saying that you had more effects on that than the pill. So what were some of those differences?
So with the pill, like I didn't see so much of a difference. I just knew not to like be wary, like don't take it if you don't need it. I didn't really see so many differences with the pill. Like, thank God, I've heard other people's reactions, and it's, horrible. In general, I am a moody person. So I don't have any like specific memories or like, red flags that went up like with taking the pill. Just like, no, I just didn't feel comfortable with it, knowing that like I'm putting hormones in my body. So it was like really more that. But with the IUD, I was I had to get it taken out because I couldn't tolerate it anymore, basically. So like with the pill, like I was on and off for a few years. The IUD, I like was pretty unhappy the entire time I had it. I was using that as birth control, or when I wasn't using it as birth control. When I was not in a relationship, it was already there. So I didn't feel the need to take it out, and eventually I felt the need to take it out because I just it was just too uncomfortable for me. And yeah.
So what were some of the effects that you had from it, using it?
So first thing is like inserting it was horribly painful. It took 3 tries because I had like a small cervix or something. I don't know. They tried 3 different times to put it in. So I was there for like, 40 minutes, just very painful to begin with. And then
Did they give you anything for the pain?
No, because they're like, oh, it'll be quick. And they're like, oh, it wasn't so quick. Let's try again. This one will be quick. Oh, let's try, because usually it's like you just, you insert it. From what I understand, you insert it and it's there and it's not so difficult. But like, I didn't have any children at the time. I know that people like post-birth have an easier time implanting the IUD than pre, because you had a baby since. So, I was only 21 at the time. And, it took 3 tries. So it was just painful to begin with. And then I spotted for over a month, like heavy spotting. And like with the pill, like with my cycle, like nothing was out of, with my natural cycle, I would just, 28, 29 days on average, with the pill also, like, because with the pill, the withdrawal bleed, I was like regular, but with the IUD, I was bleeding, like I was spotting like pretty heavily for like a whole 30 days. And after about 2 weeks, I called my doctor and I was like, so when is this going to stop? And the doctor's like, well, call us after your next period. I'm like, but I don't know when that's going to be because I'm spotting so heavily. Like, what if it comes and I miss it because like I'm still spotting from like this IUD going in?
Well, and give us an
So
idea. So, spotting heavily, did you actually have to wear, like, I don't know how you usually catch your menstrual blood, but did you have to actually wear something to catch it?
yeah, so I had to wear pads. Usually like when I'm on my period, I'll, use tampons, but because the IUD, like I wanted to like let it
Yeah,
sit for
it
a
was
little while.
just reached, so you needed to give it a minute.
Like I needed a break. So I used pads. So, but I couldn't like leave the house without pads.
Mm.
It wasn't just like a couple spots. It was like a light period.
Mm-hmm.
Lighter than like what my normal period is like the first 2 days, but like nonetheless, it was something that I felt the need to call my doctor with a concern because it was over 2 weeks and it was, still spotting. And then about, 2 weeks later, it stopped and my cycles went back to normal. So that first month was just difficult in general with like the spotting and, the insertion. But what really like kicked it off that actually got progressively worse over the year was I would get like cramps that were just out of this world, like beyond painful. Like I would keel over in like pain. And I knew it was from the IUD because I like had it, it wasn't like, where's this coming from? Because I knew before I didn't have them, I have an IUD and now I have them and they're like located in that general area. They actually got worse and worse throughout the year. They would happen once a month, once every 2 months at first, and then like it was with more frequency and it was more and more severe. So I remember once, like towards the end, my mother and I were at a musical, and like in the middle of the show, I was like keeled over in pain, and like it was noticeable for other people that were with me. They're like, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "I'm fine." Like, I'll get over it. But it was like very clear, like not normal cramps, and it had nothing to do with my cycle. So it was like really out of the blue. I would never know when it would happen. It was completely unpredictable. Yeah, it was like really.
That was going to be my next question. Like, were these pain with menstruation? But
No, no.
did you have pain with menstruation, or that was a completely separate thing?
That was a separate thing. Like my menstrual cycles I don't remember them changing. Like I still usually like I'll have cramps, like I'll have pain like the end of the first day and then like the second day where I would need to take like an Advil or a Tylenol, and then like the third day like they would, I'd be business as usual. So it was like never so it was never so difficult. And I don't remember it being any different with the IUD. Like these cramps were out of the blue, just like random times. So, yeah. And I was surprised because like, if it would happen, like looking back, I think that's crazy. But like when I was like 21, like if they happen once every month, that's okay. Like not that it's a warning sign, like look, once again, looking back at that, like that's not okay ever. But I would think to myself, like, oh, if it happens every once in a while, it's fine. Like, I'll be okay. I'll feel, it's just temporary and I'll get over it. And like the benefits outweigh like the discomfort. But really it got to a point where every few days I would just like get these cramps that would last. And they wouldn't last for so long, but it was just, they were very intense, Now that I've had like a child, I know what intense cramping is. And like, it wasn't so far off from like the beginning of my labor.
Wow. So walk us through, because I always like to paint a picture, because I'm sure there's women listening there's probably at least one woman listening who's had something similar, maybe not obviously the exact same. So you're living your life and then all of a sudden you feel like your abdomen tightening, like specifically in that area. And then this whole kind of experience of cramping and pain, how long would it typically last, just to paint us a picture?
I would say like 2 to 5 minutes.
And would it be kind of like straight, like kind of like unrelenting?
It would be like straight. It would be like stabbing pain for like 2 to 5 minutes. Like sometimes I would have to like catch my breath.
So kind of like a contraction, but you're not in labor nor pregnant.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, basically. Like now I know what a contraction is. Like it's similar. And they got progressively worse over the year. So it didn't start that way, which I found like very interesting that like you would, sometimes like you just feel, I thought like the adjustment period would be in the beginning and then my body would like get used to it. But really it just, it basically got to a point where the frequency of it happening prompted me to go to my doctor and get it removed.
Wow.
One day I came in and I was like, and we're done. Like I have like, I will pick other methods of birth control going forward because this is not for me. Yeah.
And
It
then
was just,
once you had it out, was that it? You never had
yeah,
that again?
no, no, never had it again. It was just when it was in, it just out of the blue, just 2 to 5 minute cramp. Like really, I felt like I was being stabbed in the abdomen. And then it just like went away. I spotted for like just a couple days when it was removed, and that's it. I like never happened again until I had a baby.
Wow. Well, it's interesting because I mean, with the copper IUD, I remember reading because I mean I was also looking at non-hormonal methods when I was a young lady, long time ago before I kind of figured out what I was going to do. And I remember reading something about how if you had painful periods, that there was a chance that the cramping could become worse. And so for me, that took me out of the running. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
no, that's not for me. I already have bad enough cramps.
Like straight off the bat, like,
Yeah,
not for me.
I am not going to sign up for that. No. But interesting because in your case, they were completely unrelated to your cycle. And it was just kind of like at whim, just whenever your uterus was upset, basically.
Yeah, just out of the blue when it felt like it.
Huh. Well, and now looking back on that, so before we hit the record button, we were talking a little bit just about your journey and how you discovered fertility awareness, and so you're using that now and kind of tracking your cycles. So maybe share with us just how you look back at that time, and also was it a year about that you used it, or a bit longer?
I was just a bit under a year.
Okay,
I don't think I made it to the year mark.
interesting. Well, and do you know? I mean, do you have other women in your life who've used it and had kind of the opposite experience where it was just the greatest thing ever?
So I have women who have gotten the IUD post baby. Actually, a relative of mine, she didn't have the copper IUD. She had an IUD and it actually fell out at one point, and she got pregnant
Wow.
and has an adorable baby. Like wonderfully welcome addition to the family, but unexpected.
Wow.
Very, very unexpected. Like literally, like one day, her and her husband were sitting at the table and she's like, I'm a little nauseous. And, they already have 3 kids. The youngest was 6. They thought their family was complete, and guess not. But I have some friends that have gotten the IUD like post birth. Cause like right now, like a lot of my friends were like in this stage where we're, actively building our families, but obviously like taking breaks between children. From those people, like I haven't heard so many stories the same way. When my friends ask me for my opinion, I tell them like just my personal experience. Also, a lot of people choose not to get the copper IUD because also like, people that I know, like people I'm close with, like aren't so well versed in fertility awareness and like don't really feel that hormones are so much of an issue in their lives, and like they don't try to avoid them.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't had so much experience with friends, but
yeah,
if they ask, I tell them.
Well, no, it's interesting your experience, and I mean, the copper IUD, like there's pros and cons to all birth control methods, right? So the copper IUD does permit ovulation, and so although your cycle can change a bit, and there is research to show that some women who use the copper IUD maybe experience a bit of a shorter luteal phase. So there is some evidence of some degree of hormonal disruption, but it's nowhere near at all, not in the same league of the hormonal disruption that happens
No, of
on
course. And
hormonal birth control.
That was the number one reason why I chose it.
Yes, of course. And so for many women, like this is the legit choice because obviously it allows you to prevent pregnancy, but it's like the least harmful for your hormones from that perspective.
Yeah, like for me, it really felt like the perfect choice in the moment. I understood like hormones have the potential to like really impact your body, for sure impact your body in the present, but also in the future. So I wanted to maintain my menstrual health for the future when I was ready to start a family. So it really seemed like the most logical, the most miraculous thing. And like, I didn't have so many side effects, like in terms of like moodiness and, bless you, I wasn't tracking, so I don't know what it did to my luteal phases, but like, it was really just physically unbearable to have it in.
Mm-hmm. Well, and did you have any idea that could happen?
I had no idea.
Yeah.
And I had like nobody, like some, people said like sometimes it can make your periods long. I hear it makes your periods longer and more intense, which I was like okay with because, with the warnings that you might get like more difficult menstrual cycles. For me, mine weren't so difficult that I like really, okay, so they'll be a little worse, but big deal. I'll take an extra Advil. But I never heard that like it would be so uncomfortable. Like when I cramped, I was like, I heard my IUD screaming to like get out, like leave my body now.
Well, I feel like with
nowhere.
Yeah, like with every birth control method, at the end of the day, as women, we just need to know what to expect and kind of have that clear idea of like what are the possibilities, like what are those possible effects that it could have, and so that you can make those decisions kind of quickly. I think with the IUD, it's helpful to have conversations like this just to have the sense of like, some women do experience side effects. Like in your case, it's probably safe to say most women don't necessarily experience cramping in the same way, but many women do. Some women,
I'm sure mine was like on the more extreme end, but nonetheless, it it happened.
Well, yeah, and some women expel them, meaning like their uterus physically pushes it out, and some women get pregnant while using it, which is obviously not the intended effect.
Nope.
Well, and you touched on the insertion piece, and I know that's come to light a little bit more recently. Just that kind of concept that many physicians, maybe they either aren't aware or don't really think that seriously about the pain involved in insertion, or maybe even believe that the cervix doesn't have pain receptors or whatever the case. So that's kind of a larger, broader issue for women who are wanting to get the IUD. Let's take care of that pain so that we're not experiencing pain with insertion type of thing.
Yeah, because like I knew it would be like, they say like, okay, it's going to be a little uncomfortable, but like it was uncomfortable. Like it was more than a little uncomfortable, and like it was only as he was inserting it, as I was like in this amount of discomfort, my doctor mentioned like, oh, it's because like you haven't had a child yet, so your cervix is smaller, so it might be harder at first. I'm like, well, thanks for letting me know now. Like as you're like putting it in. Like I don't know, like I don't know if knowing that like the pain would have like deterred me from it, but it would have been nice to like know all the details. And like, this was when I was 21. This was over 10 years ago. And, like now with the age of information, like with Facebook and all these like, I'm in a couple of groups where like people talk about like birth control and, what the side effects are, the pros and cons. Like now I have an open forum to ask these questions. But when I was 21, I didn't have anyone to ask. It was just really, I was young and I listened to what the doctor suggested and I really thought it was the best option. And like now knowing, like I see there's like other forms that I haven't tried. Like there's forms of birth control that I never experienced, but I hear now from people that have, had experience with them, like both positive and negative, whatever experiences they had. So, I feel like having that information is helpful in making that decision. And in the end, because well, really, and like it, other than like practicing fertility awareness, like it is a long-term non-hormonal option of birth control.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the positive part of your, like in your case, you were able to, you had the experience, but you were able to advocate for yourself, kind of speak up, and you were able to kind of find something that worked better for you. And I think for all of us as women, that's what we want. We just want the ability to kind of, try things that we think are going to work, but if they don't work, have the option to, like your doctor was quite receptive to removing it, and then you were able to find something that worked. So, well, Nina, I just want to thank you so much for being here and for sharing so openly with your story, your experience with the copper IUD. I know that these episodes really help. Just because
they help me. I listen to all of them. I'm a few behind at this point because it's just I got busy. But
what do you mean you haven't listened to all like 200?
I listened to them. Oh no! When I found fertility awareness, like so I'm living abroad right now. And I was taking the train into work, and it's like a 45-minute, ride each way. And what else am I going to do on the train? So I listen to the podcast every day. So I was able to really catch up on a lot of episodes. And now that I have a baby, I'm a little more behind. But I listen to them in order, and I just have gained so much information from them. And also the your on-air client sessions and people's not just professionals, but people's personal experience with various body literacy topics.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes. I think you have that sense of part of the reason I do this series is just to give women a voice so that we all know that every woman doesn't have the same experience, but it is important to share those experiences because there are women who do. And I'm sure that there's someone listening who's like, oh my goodness, I'm not the only one that had that cramping. And so I really appreciate you for being here today and sharing it. So thanks so much, Nina.
Absolutely. It's good to share my story and great talking to you.
Oh, likewise. So I just want to say a special thank you to Nina for coming on the show and sharing your story. I think that it was really eye-opening in my conversation with Nina to find out the types of like what her experience was like. And what you'll hear as you listen to Kathryn's story was that there's kind of parts of their stories that are related, which is really interesting. You'll even hear when I say to Kathryn, like, you're going to be really interested when you hear Nina's story. I think because we don't really talk a lot about the side effects, we don't often hear from women themselves. So when you have a concern, you might, check with your practitioner or your physician to find out what side effects are, or you might even look online to see what you can find. But hearing the actual, woman who had the birth control method or who used the birth control method share what her experience was like is really helpful because it gives you it just paints a different picture, right? Like it's more, you get more context, you get more information, and also the things that would matter to you as a woman to get a device like this. So in Nina's case, I think there's a couple of things that stood out to me. The random but severe pain that she compared to labor. It wasn't all the time, but it was just kind of like once in a while, like randomly at any time in the menstrual cycle. And you can kind of hear how she tried to find different ways to cope with it, but eventually was just like, well, it's just happened. Like I could understand that, like having random pain, like you don't know when you're going to have it, even though it's not lasting all day or anything, really impacts your quality of life. So one of the other things that I just want to point out is the painful insertion. And so this is something where recently there's been a lot more media attention about the insertion. And it's such a prime example of medical gaslighting when women are told that it couldn't possibly hurt because they don't have nerve endings in their cervix, and women are not offered any type of anesthesia and just really expected to sit there and tolerate it regardless of how it feels, which is just crazy to me. And so what I think is interesting is that in both stories, which you'll hear in a moment, both women did experience insertion being extremely painful. And even though it didn't last very long, it was still a really negative experience. And it reminds me of the episode that I released with Dana, because she described that as well. It was just a part of her story, but she described the insertion being so painful and how it even caused her to question, like, what am I doing here? And I think in her case, the insertion process was so painful that she actually didn't end up getting it put in that day, if memory serves me correct. So I will link that episode, to this episode in the show notes page. But I just think it's so important to talk about these things because often it's minimized. And a lot of women, that would be the concern. Like, is it going to hurt? What's the insertion going to be like? Oh, it's just going to take a minute. It doesn't hurt at all. But when you hear women's experiences of it, they're painting a completely different story. So with that said, let's jump into Kathryn's experience. And I'm really excited to be here with Kathryn today. Kathryn is a member of the Fertility Friday Facebook community. And as I often do, I posted in there about different hormonal birth control. And I posted about the copper IUD, and Kathryn shared her experience using it. So I'm really excited to have her here on the show today just to talk a little bit about what her experience was like. And not only did Kathryn use the copper IUD, but she also used the pill and the Mirena. So I'm really excited to delve in and find out what all of those different birth control methods were like. Welcome to the show, Kathryn.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for being here. I suppose we can jump right in. Maybe you can share with us just a little bit about your history, maybe when you had your first period and kind of moving on to your birth control experiences.
Okay, so I had my first period when I was 12, and my mother made a really big deal out of it. But it was in a wonderful way. She threw a party and took me out to dinner with my dad, and I had sort of the opposite experience of the girls you hear who had didn't know what it was and thought they were dying or something. So I got lucky there. I also managed to stay off birth control maybe a little longer than is normal. I didn't have sort of the acne or the irregular cycles that seem to make people start to take it when they're 13. So I started taking it when I was 17, the birth control pill. And it's sort of hilarious thinking back, but I was having some sort of psychological difficulties. And my mom sort of mentioned that she thought maybe it would regulate my hormones in a way that would help me kind of stabilize my moods. No idea if it did that. And I didn't really stay on it. I think I took it for about 6 months and then quit for about a year and then started taking it again when I was more like 19. And from that point on, I stayed on it for another 2-ish years. And my main side effects, I didn't have a lot. I'm maybe one of the better people for the pill. I didn't have to switch brands a whole lot or anything. I had probably some mood effects and definitely a little bit of nausea, though. There was kind of this, if I didn't eat breakfast, I was pretty miserable.
Which is pretty mild in the grand scheme of things.
When I say nausea, I wasn't throwing up. I wasn't nothing was actually happening to my body. It just felt like it could. And if I ate breakfast, I was usually okay. So I ended up talking my doctor into giving me a Mirena. She was super hesitant, mostly because I would forget the pill fairly regularly. And you have to Google your brand of pill and what the protocol is and if you're in danger. And I sort of stopped trusting myself. I had never actually had to do anything. The website had never said that I needed to use condoms or anything, but at a certain point I was like, I'm bad at this. I should get something that does not require my daily attention. So I went to the doctor and she tried to get me onto the Nuva ring and I said, no, I want a Mirena. And she said, but you have never had children. And I said, but my friend has a Mirena. And she said, okay, fine. Just a really strange thing to have happened, but okay.
Well, and interesting because now the doctors are more on the side of IUDs. Maybe it was still a bit different back then.
This was 2012 in Switzerland.
Okay. That's not that long ago.
Yeah, she was, I think, a slightly older doctor. I don't know how up on the literature she was. She basically asked me, did your friend have any trouble getting it? And I said, no. And she said, so they're prescribing those for people in the States. And my friend had gotten it in Canada, but never mind. And I said, yes. And so she said, okay, we can try it.
Interesting. My friend's doing it. Okay, we'll do it.
Yeah, terrible reasoning. But I got the Mirena, was pretty happy with it. My period stopped for 6 months, and looking back, I assume that was because I had quit the pill, but at the time I thought it was the Mirena. No idea. I mean, nobody's going to be able to prove that one.
Yeah. Well, because you mentioned in our pre-chat that you started having periods then about 6 months later, and then in retrospect, it's like, oh, maybe that was because my periods were suppressed by the pill, and that's when they actually started coming back.
Yeah, that would, in retrospect, having listened to 1,000 podcast episodes about how you don't get your period back straight away, I'm starting to think it was the pill, not the Mirena. But at the time, I figured my Mirena had moved and stopped working.
Interesting.
But it hadn't. I did get an ovarian cyst with the Mirena, which is very common. It appeared on an ultrasound within a year of me getting the Mirena. I didn't really have symptoms, or my doctor asked if I had symptoms, and I said no because I didn't know what the symptoms would be. So we just let it resolve on its own, which it did, luckily. So that was pretty great. And that was about it, other than the nausea state.
Oh, so you still had nausea with the Mirena?
Yeah. And it was different. It was probably even more mild, but it was constant. It didn't really matter if I had eaten it, but it was so mild. I don't want to overplay it. It was so mild that I didn't really notice it at first. It was sort of this thing that if I stopped and really thought about how am I feeling right now, the answer would always be slightly nauseous. Whereas if I just went about my day, it was pretty much fine.
Interesting.
And I asked my doctor about it, and looking back, I probably didn't use the right German word for nausea. Oh. And she informed me that I couldn't be having stomach pain from my Mirena because it's in my uterus, not my stomach.
Right. There was a bit of So yeah, she interpreted stomach pain and you were trying to say nausea.
I think that's what happened, because it is a known side effect of both the pill and the Mirena. So I feel like I'd like to give her the benefit of the doubt and just assume that my German was lacking in that moment. So then I moved again and got a new doctor, and I spoke English with that doctor, which was helpful because my Dutch is really bad.
Well, it sounds like, how many languages do you speak?
English, German, and a bit of Dutch.
Okay.
Now, but not at the time.
That's significantly more than me. I know 2 German words, bitte and kindergarten, because that's the same.
Well, you probably know more than 2 German words.
No, I
Like,
probably know like 4. Dankeschön.
Zeitgeist is a German word.
Oh, that makes sense because it sounds German. One of my very best friends in the whole world is German. And I've been to Germany briefly, but I didn't pick up the language in that 2-week period.
Yeah,
Surprise,
I don't
surprise.
blame you. I don't think I've ever picked up a language anywhere in less than like 6 months, being generous.
But you had a new doctor, and now there was no more of these language issues.
Yeah, no, my new doctor spoke very good English, and I asked her about it. I was like, hey, Marina, I feel like I'm kind of nauseous all the time. And my old doctor said no. And my new doctor, who is a general practitioner, she said, well, I can't say that's not happening. Do you want to take it out and see? And so we talked about what that would cost and entail and everything. And she wrote me a prescription for the copper IUD, and I picked it up from the pharmacy, which was really strange, and took it back to her about a week later, and she pulled the Mirena and popped in the copper IUD.
Well, and I just recorded another interview regarding the copper IUD, and the woman who I interviewed had some pain with insertion. Were you fine with insertion?
Not really. When I got the Mirena put in, I feel like I nearly pulled off the doctor assistant's hand.
Oh, wow.
Because she was in the room and she was holding my hand, and I feel like her bones might have been slightly crushed after that because it was pretty uncomfortable. It was pretty okay after it went in, but just like when they have to measure if your uterus is the right size, that is not pleasant.
How do they do that?
It's called a sound, and it's basically a tiny ruler, and they stick it into your uterus until it hits the top of your uterus, and then they look and see how many centimeters deep it is.
Okay, that doesn't sound pleasant at all.
You're looking at me with horror.
Well, I'm very expressive and I've got big eyes, so there's that. But I'm just thinking of inserting things and all that. So, and I said this in the previous interviews I mentioned, but lately, especially, there's been more discussion around the pain. So Nicole Jardim, I was at an event with her recently, and she used the word like gaslighting in relation to what many practitioners do to women. So you have these experiences, it is painful. And so there are times when your practitioner, like you're legitimately in pain, and your practitioner is like, it can't hurt that much. Your cervix doesn't even have any nerve endings. Anyway, so I just wanted to ask about that. So you did have some pain with insertion. Was it similar with the copper, or was it okay?
It was pretty similar. I have to say, with the copper, I had the Mirena go in and the copper the Mirena come out and the copper go in within about 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah. So it's kind of sore a little.
Is how they do it. And I also was bleeding a little bit at the time, which does help as well. We got kind of really lucky there. We'd sort of given up on me having anything resembling a period because I was at like day 70 of that cycle. But coincidentally, I started bleeding a day before, which was really good.
Oh, okay.
Because that gives your cervix a little bit more, makes it a little more open in theory. So
yeah,
easier to get something in and out, because if you try to do it when it's really closed, that's probably even less pleasant.
Yeah. Interesting.
But it was pretty bad. I actually am going to admit that I had a small stuffed animal with me because this doctor didn't have an assistant, and I knew going in that I didn't have someone's hand to rip off. Oh. So I squeezed a stuffed animal to death. But
okay, just one question I want to ask you. So scale of 1 to 10, or 0 to 10, 0 no pain, 10 like stabbing pain. Where did that insertion fall?
Probably about a 7.
7? That's high.
I mean, it doesn't last long, but that couple seconds when they measure your uterus and then actually have to insert the IUD, it doesn't, there's probably about a 30-second window in there if you've got a practitioner who knows what they're doing. That's just really uncomfortable. And I mean, yeah, it was not pleasant. But it also then, the rest of the day for me with both my insertions, the rest of the day I was a little bit crampy. It kind of got worse into the evening, and then I went to bed and woke up fine the next morning.
And did they offer you anything for the pain or anything to numb the area? I was
told to take an ibuprofen before I came, or an Advil or an Aleve or something in that family of drugs before I came both times.
Interesting. Okay.
In Switzerland, I was also given injection to like stabilize blood pressure. I have no idea what it was. I didn't ask, but that was apparently common practice in that office because they've had blood pressure can kind of tank.
Maybe because they're doing something super painful with no anesthesia. But
Maybe.
whatever, just a theory. Just a theory.
When I got the copper IUD out a couple of weeks ago, she also said I should stay in the waiting room for a couple minutes and drink something because it's common just even with removal. And that wasn't very painful. The removal tends to just kind of be a quick cramp and it's out. So that also, I think anything time you're sort of poking around in the uterus, your body is apt to do strange things.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so you've taken us through fairly mildish side effects, but interesting that the nausea on the Mirena was constant. So when you had the copper IUD in, did you know, like, was it completely fine? Did the nausea go away? And were there any other effects that you noticed?
So yeah, the nausea did not like immediately, but I did noticeably taper off after the Mirena came out. The biggest difference for me is I was never one for car sickness, and transport started making me slightly more nauseous when I had the Mirena. Like, again, I don't want to exaggerate. I'd never threw up or anything. It just like if I had to stand on a bus for more than an hour, I just felt really gross. And that's not a thing anymore. I'm back to being a roller coaster person. And I definitely had a bit of a spike in libido, which was nice. I don't think I knew that I had low libido because I kind of went on the pill before I was properly sexually active. I'd had some experiences, but not a whole lot of them. So I think that was a thing as well, looking back. But copper IUD did basically solve the nausea problem.
Okay. Well, interesting. So nausea went away, a little bit of your libido came back, which makes sense from a hormonal standpoint, because although every woman doesn't experience these obvious, overt, super severe side effects, there's physiological effects that every woman experiences, such as lowered testosterone levels and things like that, which I think is really important to point out, because I get a lot of flack. It's like, well, Lisa, everybody doesn't have bad experiences on hormonal birth control. But my whole thing is always, well, if you don't know all the things that could happen on it, even if you do experience some of those things, you would never think to make that connection. And then there's those physiological. So overall, then, your experience using the copper IUD, would you say it was positive? Let us know how long you used it and just overall what your experience was like.
So I had the copper IUD for 3 years. I just got it out last month. It was a 10-year device, so obviously something happened there. It was really great about 80% of the time. So a normal day, it was totally fine. And I did really like it and haven't 100% ruled out going back, but that's a decision I'm not making yet. I'm waiting to see how my cycles are and how things go for now. But my problems with it were I did have the kind of stereotypical quite heavy periods where, if I was going to work, I was working a job where I didn't have super consistent bathroom breaks. I would put in a menstrual cup and then put in a pad under it in case something were to go wrong in my bathroom break schedule for the day. And so that was problematic. And then I did get the really very strong cramps. So.
And did you have cramps like before? So in general with your periods, like outside of hormonal birth control?
I think as a teenager, I got little cramps. Like I remember occasionally taking an ibuprofen or filling up a hot water bottle as a teenager, but I don't remember it ever being something I would plan my day around or really considering my scheduling or life. It was just like, oh, I feel a little bit off. Maybe I'll take an ibuprofen and keep doing whatever I'm doing or something. Looking back, I don't think it was very much of a cramp.
Well, you would remember something like that if they were bad.
Yeah, no, if they were bad, I would remember them. I don't remember anything more dramatic than that.
And so then your actual bleeding was heavier. And then, so tell us about the cramping. Using the same kind of scale, 0 to 10, where were your cramps then when you were on the copper IUD?
Well, I would usually have kind of a constant, probably 2, just sort of like dull ache level of cramping. And then I would get these like really sharp stabs every once in a while.
And was that during your period? specifically?
Usually, but I would usually have a day or a night of bad cramping before it started.
Mm.
That was a pretty consistent pattern, that sometimes it was even my worst day of cramping was 3 or 4 days before my period started, which I don't know about.
And did you ever have cramping like at any other point? It was typically either during that kind of luteal phase, like before?
I would occasionally get just sort of a weird stabby twinge just at total random.
Interesting. You're really going to be interested when you hear the previous episode I recorded.
I mean, the last one that happened was the cycle I had it out. So it was before I had it out, but it was like within the last 2 months or something. And I remember this really bizarrely clearly because I was grocery shopping and I was just walking around and it was like complete middle of my cycle. And I just like got hit with this like weird pain, just like, ugh, what is that? And then it was basically gone. And then I kept walking. And then the next day it happened again. So I had like 2 in one day right in the middle of my, or 2 days right in the middle of my cycle. It was kind of like, this is weird.
Interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I mean the copper IUD is so this is not like an anti-copper, like absolutely not. The copper IUD is a really effective non-hormonal option that a lot of women really gravitate to because I mean it's one of the methods that does allow you to ovulate and continue to have some level of normalcy with regards to your hormones. So there is research to show that the cycles do shift a little bit. Progesterone levels tend to be a little bit lower because the copper IUD is causing some degree of localized inflammation. That's one of the modes of action that it works. And I don't know if that's specifically the reason why many women experience heavier periods or a little bit more pain, but we could say there may be a link there. So I think it's just helpful to talk about these things because you wouldn't expect to have kind of random cramping throughout your cycle.
No,
whenever.
That was unexpected. I was also I had been warned about it. Like you'd always read that that's a main side effect, but I figured since I didn't really have a history of cramping, it was going to be manageable. And I spent basically the next 3 years trying to manage it, trying to figure out if I could take ibuprofen or if there was something natural I could take, sort of really hoping that I wasn't going to feel like that when I was at work, because at their worst, the cramps would basically make me want to squat on the floor. Like that was the comfortable position to be in. And I had a friend who had a copper IUD who used to actually do that. She would just sort of drop to the floor in a squatting position, like something you'd associate with someone who is going through labor, not having their period. And like, so, I mean, if you're at work or at school or something, you don't want to just suddenly be squatting on the floor looking miserable. So there was always this kind of attempt to figure out how to handle them. And at the end, the decision I ended up making was that considering I did have pretty short cycles, sort of 24 to maximum 31 days, but more on the turn of 24 to 26, and that if I was having 2 or 3 days of bad cramping a cycle, that's a fair percentage of my life, actually.
Yeah.
So I decided to get the copper IUD out. I had what's actually the biggest device physically. So I figured I'd get it out. I would see how my cycles were and maybe try fertility awareness. And if that really doesn't go well with my partner and I decide that we are not the couple for that, consider getting one of the much smaller ones on the market and seeing if just a different device doesn't work better for the copper IUD. I live in Germany now, and there are at least 6 different ones available. They seem to have a lot of different models and different sizes and shapes. There's a copper ball now.
Oh, wow.
I have no idea.
Yeah, but that's really interesting. And so ultimately, your decision to come off was specifically related to your experience with this random cramping pain and also the cramping increased kind of period related stuff.
Yeah, it was basically mostly about the period related cramps because they were more constant. The kind of random cramps I had, it would kind of be there and then gone, and I didn't really have to worry. It didn't affect my day too much. It was annoying, but whereas when I was on my period or if I was having a really bad cramping day a couple days before it started, I would basically go home and curl up in bed with a hot water bottle. And if I couldn't, I would just be miserable. Well, so that was the decision.
It's so disappointing, right? Because it's such a, like, this is the answer to all of my problems, right? This is the answer to all my problems. So, well, I really appreciate you taking us through and sharing your story and your experience. because as much as I've heard about the copper IUD and read about it and spoken to women about it, what I think is interesting, I mean, you kind of have that sense of like, okay, there could be increased cramping, but you don't necessarily know how it's going to work in your case until you have it. I'm sure there's women who have it and don't necessarily have that experience. And then there's part of me that wonders if the Mirena IUD, I mean, the way that it was developed, because it does reduce the thickness of your uterine lining, that's one of the main modes of action because it doesn't always fully stop ovulation, if that's specifically to address those issues that kind of pop up with the copper IUD. So it's kind of interesting to think about the different modes of action. But thank you so much for being here, Kathryn, and sharing your story. Did you have any last thoughts, comments, or questions for any of the listeners who may have had a similar experience to you and maybe thought they were the only ones that had that kind of cramping thing happening?
Well, I suspect, find a doctor who says we can try taking it out and see what happens instead of a doctor who says no way is the side effect at all related to your birth control, because I think there are a lot of side effects that aren't necessarily recognized or admitted to. And yeah, I guess at the end of the day, what I had to keep reminding myself is no decision is permanent. Even if it's a 10-year device, you shouldn't feel super guilty about getting it removed if you're not happy with it. And that it is, it's your body.
Mm-hmm.
So
I can't kind of underscore how important what you just said is. Ultimately advocating for yourself, finding a practitioner who will take you seriously and never really feeling like, I think I like Nicole Jardom's term, like medical gaslighting. If you find yourself in the office and you have insertion pain or you have any type of symptom and your practitioner is basically saying like, no, you don't, that's just not the practitioner that you need to be working with.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Kathryn. It was my pleasure to have this chat with you.
Oh, it was my pleasure talking to you.
So, of course, I want to send a special shout out to Kathryn. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your experience. These two episodes, you can see why I wanted to put them together, because together they're really powerful just to kind of hear the experiences and listen to the parallels, because these are two women who I don't think they know each other. It just so happened that I had put up a post about copper IUDs, and there was a few women whose experiences really stood out to me. And so I reached out to them and just asked if they wanted to share their experiences on air. And so, it was only after having these conversations with them that I realized the similarities in their experiences and stories. And I also realized that it's not really something that I've heard a lot about. And actually, when I was reflecting back, just in general, I remember a close friend of mine who had an IUD, and I think it was copper. And I feel like I'm going to have to reach out to her and just have a little phone call or chit chat. But this is a friend of mine. We used to work together years and years ago. And I just remember that every now and then she would just have this crazy abdominal cramping to the point that she would just have to go home from work. And it really clicked. I don't think Nina and Kathryn are the only women who have this experience. And, in Kathryn's case, what I think is important, I'm always stressing this. The purpose of these episodes is not to say like use it or don't use it. It's really just to highlight women's experiences so we can have a conversation about it. If you're going to have a device inserted that could potentially be there for, 2, 3, 5, 10 years, I think it's helpful to have a conversation just about what women have experienced. Not to say that every woman experiences this, because I think we all know that every woman doesn't. But just to think about the aspect of, having this experience of cramping. And I think the most challenging part of it is if you don't know, like if it's at random, I think that's the interesting thread for me, that these women were experiencing it, but it wasn't with their periods all the time. It was often just completely random outside of this period and no real pattern. You can't really plan for it and having to try to manage that. So I think that's really interesting. And I also think it's interesting that in both cases, they were basically describing it equivalent to the early stages of labor, meaning that the pain was really significant, even if it wasn't going on and on for a long duration. What stood out to me also with Kathryn's story was her experience of nausea, because I haven't really spoken to that many women who had that feeling. And so, when she had the Mirena IUD, it was like this constant feeling of nausea. And there was still I just thought that was a really interesting effect, because you wouldn't really think. And also, I think at some point she said, it wasn't like I was throwing up all the time. I don't want to make it seem like it was worse than it is. It was just that I always felt kind of yucky. And I think that's important because, again, we have a tendency to downplay it. We all know that there's some women that experience worse things. And so it's really easy to be like, oh, I only had this experience. It wasn't that bad. But I think it's just important to say what did happen so that we all know, because no one wants to feel nauseous all the time. And I suppose one last thing that stood out again, and I mentioned this as well around Nina's story, was the painful insertion, which Kathryn described on a scale, 7 out of 10, which is high. That's high pain. And even though it was for a short period of time. So I'm not sure what talking about this practice of inserting IUDs in women without pain, without addressing the fact that it hurts or without providing any type of pain management protocols or anything. I don't know how talking about it on the podcast is going to make a difference in the world, but I think it's really important for us to talk about that. If you're planning to get an IUD, talk to your practitioner about that. I have concerns about this. I've heard that there are some women who have an extremely negative experience and experience pain with insertion. What can you do for me? And so, to my knowledge, I don't know if there are practitioners that address this. If you know, let me know. So if you've used an IUD, whether it's the copper IUD or, the hormonal, the progestin IUD, whatever brand, if you've used either, I'd love to hear from you. I'll start a thread in the Fertility Friday Facebook group. So you can find us over at fertilityfriday.com/community. And yeah, let's talk about it. If you had a really great experience and you didn't experience any of this type of cramping or bleeding, or if you did experience some degree of it, but it wasn't enough to just deter you, because, in Kathryn's case, she described it, it was fine 80% of the time, but it was just at specific times that, it had these issues. But overall, her experience wasn't overly negative. It was just that there were specific concerns that she had at certain times. So yeah, I want to talk about it. I want to hear about what your experience was like. And I want to just kind of keep the conversation going, because I think it's just really important. This is a part of informed consent. This is what informed consent looks like, finding out how other people's experiences have been and getting kind of the real story, what it was actually like for them, what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it, if they would do it again, and if they would recommend it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/247. So I just want to thank you for spending some time with me today, for taking some time to tune in to the show, for supporting the show, sharing, different episodes with your friends. If you know somebody who has used the copper IUD or has questions about it, or even has had a hard time with it, this episode would be a great one to share, especially because I got the sense when I was talking to both Kathryn and Nina that, if it was kind of they weren't sure if other women also have had the same experience. And of course, that was one of the reasons that prompted them to share their story, because they want other women to know, if you did experience something like this when you use the copper IUD, you're not alone. And I think that's really important. So if you know somebody who has had an experience like this, or, is looking at all the different birth control options and just wanting to get an idea of what some of the challenges are associated with it, because I feel we all know, with every birth control method, there's going to be positives, there's going to be negatives, there's going to be challenges. And it really comes down to which challenges do you want with respect to the birth control method that you choose. And so thank you once again to Nina and Kathryn for coming on the show and sharing your story. I really appreciate it. And I know that it's going to be a really powerful episode for a lot of women. If you're in the stage where you're seriously considering fertility awareness as your primary birth control method, or if you've already started using it or been using it for a while and are wanting to really take your confidence up to the next level so that you can really get that top effectiveness rate of it, I think a big part of it is the peace of mind. Whenever you are using something like the fertility awareness method in particular, there's so many little things that come up. There's so many little nuances, whether we're talking about cervical mucus, whether we're talking about basal body temperature or cervical position. I'm all over social media on all the platforms. And so I get a lot of questions and comments. And what's interesting is often the questions that I get, they're almost posed as if they're general, but they're typically quite specific challenges that you might be having, whether it's challenges interpreting or understanding your mucus patterns, or whether it's challenges interpreting or understanding the temperature. And ultimately, one of the challenges with, the fertility awareness method is that it's a method that requires a bit of instruction and also a bit of practice. And it's basically something that you learn. It's like a skill that you learn. And just because of its very nature, it's really helpful to have somebody there to guide you. What makes the fertility awareness method unique is that it's not a device. And it's not a drug. And so it's basically, it's based on our actions. It's something that we have to learn to do. And it's based on the actions that we take and having to interpret our signs. And that makes it more subjective because every woman's experience isn't the same. And so even if you're getting support from a friend who knows how to use fertility awareness, that friend has only ever seen her own cycle. And so what that means from what I've seen over the years is that the women that I work with and support, many of them have cycles that are completely different to mine. And so my training and experience has prepared me to be able to support women regardless of what is happening with their cycle. Because what you quickly learn when you jump into this field is that, every woman isn't you, and every woman has her own challenges and struggles. And so in order to really gain that confidence in using the method, working with an instructor like myself that's very experienced, who's been certified and trained, it allows you to be able to adapt to all of these different types of situations. And so I've supported women who struggle with, low mucus production, who struggle with having mucus all the time, who have abnormal bleeding throughout their cycles, whose, cycles are falling within the normal range, women who are ovulating very sporadically and have longer cycles. And so, that's the benefit of joining the 10-week Fertility Awareness Mastery Group program, is that regardless of where you are, I meet you there. And we really work together to both help you understand and use the fertility awareness method confidently and identify any issues that might be coming up on your charts and on your cycles. Really doing that kind of detective, investigative work to find out what we can learn about your health through your cycles and help you to make progress so that you can move towards having cycles that are falling more within the normal parameters. So again, I invite you to join us. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/group program for more information. And with that, I will let you go. Have a wonderful week, day, weekend, wherever you are in the week listening to this. I hope you have a great day. And as always, be well and happy charting.